Okay, so we did the Vietnam War, and um, so an overview, it was in between 1957 and 1975, and it was against South Vietnam and North Vietnam, and it was between like a communist and an anti-communist unified country. Some important dates are the so what kind of started it all is in 1846 there was the Indochina Wars, and Indochina was just French colonies in Asia that were owned, and then so in 1945 North Vietnam declared its independence from France, and in 1954 Vietnam was like completely independent when in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, South Vietnam declared its independence. And the Vietnam War is there's no like certain date when it started, but when in 1959 that's when firefights started to engage, and in 1965 the U.S. entered the war, and in 1967 there were anti-war demonstrations that took place in the Pentagon and Lincoln Memorial. Um, March 29, 1973, the U.S. pulled out of the Vietnam War, which eventually led to, on April 30th, 1975, the fall of Saigon, which meant that the South fell to the North and Vietnam had become a unified communist country.
The opposition of the Vietnam War gained national prominence in 1965 because critics of the war questioned the government's claim that it was fighting a democratic war to liberate the South Vietnamese people from communist aggression. Anti-war movement, the anti-war movement began mostly on college campuses, and opposition to the Vietnam War was discussed in teach-ins that were organized by the Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS. Um, on October 21st, in 1967, one of the most prominent anti-war demonstrations took place, where 100,000 protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, and 30,000 of them marched to the Pentagon later that night. Hundreds of protesters were arrested after confrontation with the U.S. Marshals and soldiers who were protecting the Pentagon. The domino theory was a theory that a political event in one country will cause similar events in neighboring countries, like a falling domino causing an entire row of appended dominoes to fall. The containment in the Vietnam War was the policy of containment aimed not to fight an all-out war with the Communist Soviet Union, but rather confine communism and the Soviet Union to their existing boundaries.
The Vietnam War was a proxy war in the Cold War, and though the US and Soviet Union didn't directly go to war against each other, they supported the opposing sides of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was part of a larger regional conflict as well as a manifestation of the Cold War itself. Conflict was intensified in Vietnam by the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Vietnam was a part of Indochina, which were ruled by French-ruled colonies until the Indochina Wars in 1946. And from 1954 to 1975, Vietnam split into two countries. North Vietnam, also known as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, had the Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh, who declared independence from Indochina in 1945. He's the one who established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Communists led the Viet Minh, who established themselves in North Vietnam, and Diem's authoritarian regime was challenged by local communists backed by the regime in North Vietnam. They also used guerrilla warfare, which was a form of combat that utilizes ambushes, sabotage, and other aggressive forms of combat. It also involves groups of men, possibly armed civilians, who attack larger groups of men. South Vietnam, also known as the Republic of Vietnam, was created in 1954 in May, where the French defeated the French in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and South Vietnam gained independence from the French and Indochina. In South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam was effectively independent since May of 1954. The president Ngo Dinh Diem declared it as a republic after his election in 1955. The South Vietnam was heavily supported by the U.S., and it was seen as a fortification against communism. The U.S. supported them by using bomber aircrafts.
So some major parties involved were obviously the anti-communist and the communist. So the U.S. and South Vietnam were anti-communist, and the Soviet Union and North Vietnam were communist, and another country that played a role was in France for the Indochina.
Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Vietnamese Communist Party. He was the founder of the League for Independence of Vietnam, or the Viet Minh, in 1941, and he was the president of the Democratic State of Vietnam after the Viet Minh seized Hanoi, and he was called Uncle Ho. And he was the president for North Vietnam for 25 years and was a symbol of Vietnam's struggle for unification.
Today, Vietnam is a communist country. Right now, there's an Indochina refugee crisis, a large overflow of people from the former French colonies in Indochina, and over the next 25 years, after the French colonies of Indochina War, more than 3 million people would become refugees in other countries of Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, or China. Many died in their attempt to flee, and more than 2.5 million Indochinese were resettled, mostly in North America, Australia, and Europe. 500,000 were repatriate, either involuntarily or voluntarily. The Vietnam War ended with the Paris Peace Accords, which were signed on January 27, 1973. The treaty was between the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and Viet Cong. It called for a ceasefire through all of Vietnam and the withdrawal of all troops within 60 days. It also called for the withdrawal of all troops from Laos and Cambodia. There also was a demilitarized zone across the 17th parallel. However, South Vietnam refused to recognize the Viet Cong's provisional government, and they had to sign a whole separate document that made no reference to the Viet Cong government whatsoever.
The end. Okay.